Simon Parkin in the morning. BBC Somerset.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for choosing to spend your Friday with us. It's BBC Somerset. It's 6 minutes past 10. And just for a change, we are out and about this morning. We are in the Kittybanks Cafe in the centre of Wells. And the reason why we're here is because we have the MP for this very region, for this very constituency, here with us this morning. James Heappey, good morning.
Good morning.
It's quite a big constituency. You've got some big busy towns in here: Cheddar, Street, Walton, Chilcompton, Wedmore, Axbridge, Highbridge, Burnham-on-Sea, Glastonbury, Shepton Mallet. Obviously Wells, where we are this morning, and you're kind of always out and about in it, aren't you? Already you've been out busy this morning, you've got more stuff to do today.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the great thrill of being the MP for a place like this. You know, there are at times, don't get me wrong, it'd be great to be the MP for somewhere like Taunton, where you are the MP for one town, where there is one newspaper and there is one set of civic events. But actually, the amazing thing about my constituency is that I have Burnham, Highbridge, Cheddar, Wells, Shepton, Glastonbury Street, lots of wonderful villages as well, all of which have their own calendars that you are invited to participate in. Clearly, you can only be in one place at once. But there's just so much going on and so many different businesses to support. I mean, it's a great constituency and a wonderful thing to be involved with.
Of course, you've got to keep an eye on what's happening in the real world as well. And Brexit has been much in the news for, well, it feels like forever now. And it feels like it's been, we've been heading a brick wall for a little while, with negotiations being slow, all been a bit tricky today. We've had a breakthrough. So the Prime Minister, Theresa May, struck a last-minute deal with the EU to move Brexit talks on to the next phase. No hard border in Ireland, and EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU will see their rights protected. So, I mean, that's the headline. What do you think of the way that Brexit has been so far?
Well, look, I mean, I think for political rookies like me, there have been plenty of moments when you would have started to go, what on earth is going on here? How on earth is this ever going to come right? In fairness, there have been a number of wiser heads at Westminster who have been saying for some time, both privately and in the media, look, this is the way that negotiation with the EU goes. And your colleagues in the BBC newsroom, I suspect, know that it always goes on to the third extra day of negotiations, then at 4 o'clock in the morning, finally from nowhere, an agreement appears. I think the Prime Minister has showed extraordinary fortitude to keep going, to stick to the task, and to end up getting a deal, because at times it has looked like it is going to be an extraordinary challenge to find agreement between both domestically in our sort of partnership with the DUP and Parliament, internationally in terms of our bilateral relations with Ireland, and also with the sort of wider relationship with the European Union. And well, there she goes. She's done it.
Well, she's done a bit of it. There's still quite a long way to go. But I mean, did you think it was going to be this chaotic? The infighting that it's caused.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're a parliamentary democracy, and people are invited to go up to Parliament and to represent their constituents and their constituencies, but also to bring to bear their own views and their own expertise in order to make sure we come to the right decision. I think that one of the great things that's been happening in the last 6 months or so is that because the parliamentary arithmetic has been as challenging as it is, you've got Parliament really showing its teeth, and the government, the executive, is being held to account every second of every day and being required to change direction in order to ensure that it has the support of the House of Commons. And I think that, yes, it looks a bit chaotic. Yes, it has made this a very nervous and bumpy ride. But the fact is that Parliament has been wholly engaged, holding the executive to account, and the executive has come good and delivered a deal that looks like it will be acceptable to Parliament. Quite extraordinary.
When a deal happens, as it has in, this morning was sort of 7, 8 o'clock, when we got news that finally there'd been a breakthrough, what happens to you MPs? When are you briefed about this? Are you on a WhatsApp group? Do you get a ping from Theresa May saying, right, here's what you need to know?
So we are on a WhatsApp group, and the WhatsApp group has been buzzing quite a lot this morning. Not as much as yesterday when we were trying to get our colleague Ben Bradley over the line for Parliamentary Beard of the Year award.
The important issues dealt with first and foremost, obviously.
There were a lot of people sort of revving each other on over that. But the fact is that the Parliamentary Party are pretty excited. In reality, we hadn't had much of a heads up as to what was coming. I think because I'm not sure that much of what happened last night was theatre for the sake of creating drama. I think that very genuinely, the phone calls that were going on all night through until when the Prime Minister went off to Northolt to get on the plane out to Brussels were because it was still not in the bag. There were things that needed to be discussed, and the rights of EU citizens issue, I think. I'm not surprised that we've reached an agreement on that, and I know that the relationship with the ECJ will be troubling for some of my colleagues. But I think when you look at the scale of that issue, the number of cases that's likely to involve, I just don't think that's really a big issue. But the real achievement is to find a line, a combination of words in that agreement that is acceptable to both the government in Dublin and to the DUP. That's an amazing piece of political work by the Prime Minister and her team overnight.
It's quite an uncomfortable relationship with the DUP, though, isn't it? Or from the outside looking in, it's not easy, that one, is it?
Well, certainly for someone like me who is on the sort of more liberal end of my party, there are things that the DUP stand for that I find totally unacceptable. But we're not in coalition with them. We're in a confidence and supply relationship with them. And there are things on which we have clear shared purpose, and there are things on which we have very clear disagreement, on which we have so far been able to find workarounds. The most obvious one was the amendment in the Queen's speech over abortion rights in Northern Ireland. And there was a way of dealing with that, which was to guarantee the right of Northern Irish women to be able to come to England for an abortion, which satisfied my instincts as someone who absolutely believes in a woman's right to choose, whilst being acceptable to the DUP. So there are ways of doing this. Just because they are in a confidence and supply relationship with us does not mean in any way that their politics become our politics. I would not be acceptable. I'm not willing to accept that in one bit.
As far as the Brexit negotiations go, this is one hurdle. There are certainly many more to come. What kind of deal do you want?
Well, I think that what mattered to me more than anything, really, and I was a Remainer. I was never. Europe has never been a big part of my politics anyway, if I'm honest with you, either sort of massively enthusiastic or massively against. But on balance, I decided last year that I was going to vote Remain. But my constituency and the country disagreed with me. My constituency disagreed with me by a wider margin than the country as a whole. And so I have long since acquiesced to that instruction. What mattered to me, though, was that we were able to find a deal that was acceptable to the vast majority of people. And almost for the last week or two, as the deal has been starting to form, the fact that my inbox has had ever so slightly less Brexit correspondence than normal, so we're starting to pick off people who are sort of towards the extremes but not quite at the extremes, and now you've just got the most die-hard Liberal Democrats sort of still complaining that we're leaving at all, and the most die-hard UKIPers complaining that it's not a hard enough Brexit, we should be sort of marching off into the distance with our fingers up at the EU. I just think, actually, if you've triangulated into that place where it's only a very small number of extremists at either end of the Brexit spectrum that are still complaining, that you're probably getting into broadly the right place that appeals to the silent majority. And crucially, that means we can move on to trade. Your question was, what have I wanted out of all of this? I have wanted, for all of this process stuff at the start, to be resolved as quickly as possible, because what matters to me more than anything else is our continued relationship with the EU from a trading perspective. and it looks like we're now going to give ourselves plenty of time to deliver that.
Presumably, Theresa May, on a day like today, breathes a huge sigh of relief and feels that little bit more relaxed about her position. I mean, do you think she is now in a strong position? Do you think more of the party will be behind her as far as the negotiations continue? Or do you think there's still a bit of jeopardy there? I mean, is she the person, do you think, to take us through these tough, tricky negotiations still?
I think she's absolutely the person to take us through these tough, tricky negotiations. I mean, if you line up the current cabinet and all of those who might reasonably from outside the cabinet think they had a chance of replacing her, it's very hard to see which of them could actually stand up right now on the global stage and do as she is doing. So very obviously she's the person to keep going. And if you look in the, remember that the media, you know this, but what you're looking for is colourful opinion that's going to make interesting broadcast. And therefore, naturally, the 318 members of the Conservative Party that are sort of broadly in agreement with the Prime Minister aren't that interesting for you to put on air. But the 5 or 6 people at either end of the spectrum who are going to say stuff that is dissenting or is more colourful clearly makes much more interesting stuff for you to broadcast and more interesting people for you to and your colleague is writing down like Jacob. You're absolutely right. Jacob makes great broadcasts right now because Jacob has very, very strong views, and and there will be bits of the deal this morning that I am sure that Jacob Rees-Mogg is a bit cautious about, but that's great. I mean, that's Jacob doing what he does, and there's no doubt that he, just like Anna Soubry, Ken Clarke, Nicky Morgan, by them being out there doing what they're doing at either end, they are helping to calibrate the deal in a way that takes us forward.
But we, the normal people who don't have access to, I mean, yes, we can come and see you in one of your constituency when you have your surgeries or whatever. We can find you, but we don't have access to you. We don't have access to Theresa May. We don't have a voice. We can certainly phone the local radio station. We can write to the papers, but we're not necessarily going to be taken seriously. And there will be people who hear your Jacob Rees-Moggs, your Anna Soubrys, all the people you've mentioned, making points that they care about, and someone's got to make those points, because you mentioned that all of the other MPs in the middle who are in Theresa May's party are, they're broadly behind her, they're broadly supportive. Well, we need people to challenge her. We need to know that it is all going to be all right in the end, because at this point, we don't necessarily get a sense of that very often.
Well, we're only 3 hours after the deal being announced, and that already seems quite a revisionist view of what's been going on over the last 5 or 6 months. I'm not sure that I can remember, in all the time that I've been interested in politics, a more challenging period in which the nation's press, Parliament, both on the government's benches and on the opposition benches, and internationally from other governments around Europe and indeed the world, as well as from sort of non-government actors like the CBI, the TUC, the Institute of Directors, there's been the most extraordinarily intense and public debate over what Brexit should look like. So the idea that ordinary people somehow are in the dark as to what is going on over Brexit and have no voice in this, absolute nonsense. I mean, this is what's been going on since the general election, which was, in hindsight, clearly a very bad idea. But it is delivered in Parliament, in which the voice of the British public is more important than it has been, probably since the mid-90s, when Parliament was last in that sort of state. MPs have to be acutely aware of where the public in their constituency are at. And I've been getting so much correspondence, and you see it oscillate, So after you'd get weeks and weeks and weeks of people writing to you saying, oh, this Brexit is a disaster, we need to stop it, and we're going to hell in a handcart. And then Prime Minister gives the Florence speech, and all of a sudden those people stop writing, and all of the sort of passionate Brexiteers start writing to you and sort of calling betrayal and everything else. But of course, as you go through that and you see the different people coming into your inbox, it helps you to understand and to calibrate. The one other bit that has been hugely important is actually to get away from social media and to get away from my inbox and to do something like go down to the local rugby club or the football club on a Saturday morning and just meet parents of kids playing football, because they are the silent majority that never write to their MP, that never turn up on social media ranting. And actually what you find is that away from the news bulletins, away from social media, away from the sort of furore of an MP's inbox. Actually, most people have just been sort of getting on with their lives. They've accepted the result, and what they wanted was sort of progress towards a deal, mostly so they felt like the trade deal was coming. That's the bit that has been bothering people the most, I think, ever since the referendum.
Okay, well, it's 10:20, it's BBC Somerset. We are with James Heappey. He is the MP for Wells. And if you have a question, if you've got an issue you want to raise, we are on 0345 303 1566. You can text 81333, start your message with the word Somerset, or you can email somerset@bbc.co.uk. James is with us until 11 o'clock this morning, so move fast if you've got something important that you want to say. Meanwhile, 10:21, here's an important message from the BBC.
Charlie Taylor.
BBC Somerset.
I'm looking for someone who has been in a death-defying situation, someone who has proved a medical prognosis wrong.
I was on a ship. There's a fire. There's flames coming up through the middle of the ship. That's when I said my prayers.
Yeah.
Charlie Taylor.
Back in 1991, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and I asked, how long do you think I've got? You could possibly look forward to 5 years. All medication was stopped. It hasn't come back.
Here you are, still going very strong.
Absolutely.
Tomorrow morning from 10.
I have a border collie, severed an artery in his leg. They managed to save him. He'd contracted gastroenteritis.
Oh, goodness.
It's a nightmare.
BBC Somerset.
Yep, that's us. It's 10:21. We are with the MP James Heappey, who's got a mouthful of bacon sandwich. So you'll be pleased to know that you can pause for a moment and have another mouthful, because Gordon is with us. Good morning.
Good morning.
Gordon, who are you? Why are you here?
I'm a resident nowadays in Wells for the last 10 years. I come from Northern Ireland, hence the question that I have for James.
Okay, so ask your question then.
Well, of course, we're in the middle. Mendip is the middle of an area that voted. Wells is in the middle of Mendip, which voted Remain over a year ago, and therefore it's not an easy situation. And I know James himself voted Remain, but some of the problems that Brexit is throwing up are giving me deep cause for concern. Not least 45 billion or more than that of a bill. But the Northern Ireland question, I listened to Theresa May this morning and Mr Juncker speaking. And it was clear to me that there's a very vague arrangement which the DUP has now agreed to. And I could consider it nothing else other than a fudge, that at some point in the future we still have the fundamental problem that if you remove yourself, if Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom, which it will do, and I want it to, of course, Southern Ireland will remain in the EU. So you've the direction in which we're heading at the moment anyway, you have two different customs arrangements, two different trade arrangements. And what worries me is the trade across the border, which is of paramount importance to local people. It may not be of paramount importance to the rest of the United Kingdom or even the EU, but it's certainly paramount importance to a huge number of people who live in Northern Ireland and the South.
So a fudge, would you say, James, is it?
Well, I mean, again, I think it's too early to say. I don't think that that's the case. I think that the Irish government have been very clear in what they have needed to see in order to avoid exactly the situation that Gordon describes. And I have the advantage of having some personal experiences. I've been based in Northern Ireland for 2.5 years out of my 10 years in the military. And in the final year and a half, I was living in Ballykinler, which is in County Down. And my wife was driving over the border every Monday to go down to work at Innocent Drinks in Dublin, and then coming back up on a Tuesday night and working from home the rest of the week. And so enjoyed absolutely that freedom to sort of work on both sides of that international border without any hindrance whatsoever. I think that what we've spoken about is a full alignment. So the day after Brexit Day, the customs arrangement and all of the sort of regulatory standards that we set looks exactly the same as it did before. Now, that's always been the aim, in fairness. And by the way, I think it's something we're aiming for on our other international border between the UK and France, Belgium, Holland, over on the North Sea and Channel Coast as well. Clearly, because it is a land border that is incredibly fluid, the Northern Ireland border presents a slightly different challenge, but not not a massively different challenge, I don't think, sort of Dover Folkestone. And I think that, if the DUP have accepted that we can do this with a sort of soft, digital, whatever you want to call it, border, I think we can go there. I mean, it is going to be quite reasonable to say, well, there's a lot of detail left to be seen, and I would not disagree with the immediate past mayor of this fine city like this on air anyway. But I think that the reality is that it's a big step forward, and I'm certain Dublin owe us nothing. There's no way in the world that Dublin would have agreed to the text of the deal as it is if they thought that this was a fudge and that somehow it would be unworkable.
Happy with that?
Well, inevitably, no, I'm not happy with that, but James will understand that. I do believe we have a fudge, we have a compromise. I suppose that's a better word to use for the time being. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that at some time the crunch point is coming. You have a DUP view, you have a Sinn Féin view, you have a Southern Ireland view, and you have an EU and UK view. They do not come together. So that therein is the fundamental problem of some months from now.
Well, I suspect there is more for us to find out, but we thank you for getting involved, Gordon, this morning. Moving on, let's talk about the wider political world. And there was a general election recently that some would say was ill-advised. And what it gave rise to was... Jeremy Corbyn being taken perhaps a little bit more seriously. Have a listen to this message.
I'm Bill from Wales. One of my biggest concerns is what is the present government going to do to combat the threat of a Corbyn Parliament in the near future. I.e., it would appear that the young people of today get their news from sound bites on their mobile phones. And so, as a consequence, is the government and yourself as representative in this area thinking or doing anything about that to present the true picture to the youth of today that tend to be voting for Mr Corbyn?
Now, you mentioned that, with the Brexit issue, there's a lot on social media, and if that's where young people are getting their news and the other parties are perhaps a bit better at using social media, you can see why there was suddenly a surge for Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about it that, interestingly, in the 2015 general election, in the post-mortem by the media, the view was that the Tories had done social media, particularly Facebook, much better than other parties. But there's no doubt about it that in 2017 that wasn't the case. Momentum have a very sophisticated online offer, and that is animating people and reaching people in a way that political messaging hasn't been able to do previously. There is a wider challenge with social media which taps into the whole sort of fake news issue that the BBC and other more trusted broadcasters are as concerned about as we politicians are, and that is the sort of algorithmically delivered certainty that is a social media timeline. And a lot of people don't realise that the way that the social media algorithms work is the more and more that you interact with posts, the more that platform learns from what you're doing to deliver things onto your timeline that you're likely to agree with. So it means that you get lots and lots of people writing to you or phoning into your show saying, I don't know anybody that disagrees with my view. And it's like, well, no, of course you don't, because social media is algorithmically set up to be an echo chamber to your views, and unless you consciously interact with things that you don't agree with in order to challenge yourself, your timeline will just keep reinforcing itself to make it ever more certain. So how on earth do you cut through that, not only from the perspective of just party political communication, but just generally? I had a fascinating conversation with some of your colleagues in Westminster a couple of weeks ago, and they're sort of concerned that they can see stories running that are coming out of sites like Squawk Box or Canary or whatever else, and they know that it's not the case, and they've spent a career in journalism working really, really hard to reach the point that they have in the BBC. They've developed sources, they've got a real instinct for what's right and what's wrong, and there they are finding that they are being totally left out of the debate because others have just jumped in there and put something out that's not true. And it's very challenging when those algorithms are constantly reinforcing what people want to hear. It's very challenging to cut through and to put across a different opinion.
If you take social media out of it, though, certainly what happened with the election was young people were mobilised by politics, and most of them, it seems, Jeremy Corbyn is the person who struck a chord. Now, for a party like yours, you know, you are always probably going to struggle to entice young people in.
No, that's not true.
Why is it not true?
Because in 2015 that wasn't the case. Look at the shift in how demographics
and look at how
changed.
very quickly it changed.
Well, no, I mean, what two things changed? Three things. Firstly, Brexit changed enormously. That redistributed votes very aggressively between Leave and Remain. Secondly, momentum happened with Jeremy Corbyn, and I don't know that tons of that is to do with Jeremy Corbyn. It's just a lot to do with the way that the message was delivered and what it was. And you cannot take social media out of it, because there were stories that were running in the general election that were entirely that you could not have run on the BBC, because you knew that they weren't true. But that didn't mean that they weren't cutting through into people's opinions of what was going on in the general election, because people were getting their news from social media. So that happened, and there's nothing, and there's no sort of mistaking that. And then the third thing is, undoubtedly, our manifesto was a complete shambles. And that sort of, you know, and that let us down enormously, because we managed to find a way of annoying both our core vote and the people we were trying to win over, which is quite an achievement. And thank heavens that, you know, we held on and Jeremy Corbyn didn't win. But that was an entirely entirely self-inflicted injury.
Well, and, you know, the fact Theresa May went into it with so much optimism, but, you know, Jeremy Corbyn did suddenly look like he could be a Prime Minister. I mean, do you see...
No, I don't. I genuinely don't think that ever happened. I think there was on the doorstep, there was never anybody turning around saying, oh God, I've been really impressed by Jeremy Corbyn. What everybody was saying is, I'm really annoyed by Theresa May. I'm actually not sure I'm going to vote for her because I'm really cross at at her calling this election, and the fact she won't go on the debates, and the fact that she's not doing a good campaign, and she's saying this and I don't agree with it. And there was a sort of, I think that there was a safety net in people's minds that was making them believe that we were so far ahead that a Corbyn government was inconceivable, and so actually they could be cross at the campaign Theresa May was fighting and still know that Jeremy Corbyn wasn't going to be the Prime Minister. Now, that doesn't in any way diminish the premise of Bill's question, because it was Bill, wasn't it? Because the fact is that what Corbyn, since the sort of mid-90s, since John Smith started to bring the Labour Party across into the sort of political centre ground.
Yeah, the whole new Labour movement.
Yeah, there's been a consensus certainly on economics within British politics, that have been sort of free market, capitalist, and Labour thought that socialism was pretty toxic electorally. The problem is that because no one has been rehearsing those arguments about the freedom that comes with the free market and the sort of the freedom that comes with the ownership of capital, nobody's been having that discussion since I was 12, 13, and therefore there's no. It's not obvious to people that our railway is now better because it's no longer nationalised. It's not obvious.
It's not obvious because the fares keep going up and there are cancellations all the time.
Well,
of course it's not obvious.
Well, then that's a very wistful view of British Rail, though, if you honestly think that. I mean, if you look at statistically, actually delays are significantly less than when the railway was nationalised. Customer satisfaction is significantly higher than when the railway was nationalised. But people need to be having that discussion, because we haven't been having it for 20 years. People haven't been talking about why government is not as good as the market in working out, in sort of innovating, in delivering new products to... the iPhone doesn't happen under a sort of government-led communications industry, because the government just doesn't innovate with the fervour that private enterprise does. But we've got to start having those discussions again and making people realise, because the irony of young people using sort of high-tech, things in their, phones in their hand, using multinational, high-tech social media platforms to communicate, enjoying all of the trappings of a free market economy whilst railing against it. That's not their fault. It's the fault of us in politics, the media, the commentariat, from just not rehearsing those arguments anymore. We need to get back into the habit of doing so.
It's 10:35. It's BBC Somerset. We are going to do a travel update in just a moment. We've got James Heappey in the hot seat with us. He's MP for Wells. Just to sort of get us back to where we were. So you don't see Jeremy Corbyn as a threat still?
Jeremy Corbyn is the biggest threat this country has faced in a very, very long time.
A threat to your party, though?
No, threat to the United Kingdom.
Okay. Theresa May, how well placed is she to lead your party?
Well, I mean, I think that she is very well placed right now because she is the Prime Minister. She's doing a good job on Brexit. And by the way, given the sort of question that you just asked about sort of Jeremy Corbyn, isn't it extraordinary that given the apparent unpopularity of the Conservative Party, the apparent unpopularity of Theresa May, that in the polls we are, a couple of points behind, and that in some polls she is still ahead of him in terms of who would lead. Labour are quite right. When you see Labour people in various things around Westminster, at think tanks and things, just pointing out that if they were really that good and we were really that bad, we would be 20 points behind them right now.
But then we've had our fingers burnt with polls very recently. So
I know. And it's very convenient when to start saying, well, let's not trust the experts. But the reality is that it's, you know as well as I do that right now, if the narrative that you were seeking to reinforce there about Corbyn on the up, May on the down, if that was really true, the polls would not be within the margin of error. Labour would be miles and miles and miles ahead. And what that tells you is the British public know full well that whilst Theresa May really annoyed them in the general election, and whilst we have had a pretty bad 6 months, Jeremy Corbyn is absolutely not a Prime Minister in waiting.
Okay. 10:37, just to put you right, it's not a don't trust the experts, don't trust anyone, James. That's the rule. We
not
live
even
by
the BBC.
Right, it's the BBC. It's BBC Somerset. 10:37, good morning. We are in the hot seat with James Heappey. Good morning, it's Friday and it's a chilly Friday at that. We have blue skies, we have some cloud, and we have the risk of one or two scattered sleet and snow showers, particularly over the higher ground. But for many of us it will stay dry, but don't be fooled by any sunshine. Feels bitterly cold in that wind. Your top temperature 5 Celsius, 41 Fahrenheit. Factor in the wind chill, flipping freezing. Right, 10:39. It's BBC Somerset. It's the hot seat until 11, and we have James Heappey with us. We talked a lot about big issues. Let's talk about big issues that affect your constituents on a local level, and have a listen to this.
I am Becky from Wales. I would like to ask whether you would, is there any way that we could increase parking on new developments within Wales and parking within the city of Wales for visitors and for those working in Wales? We are on a new development and we have people who work in Wales parking on our development.
Because they're using that as a way of parking there and then coming into town.
Yeah, and it stops them from paying the parking fees as well.
And how frustrated does that make you then, as the person who's living in one of those houses?
It's not so bad as long as they park considerately.
And I'm guessing maybe that doesn't always happen.
It doesn't always happen. No.
It's one of those issues, isn't it, where we all want to get free parking if we can, but we forget who might be affected by it. What do you do to help, Becky?
Well, Becky raised two issues then. The first is I think Becky lives on the Crest Nicholson development on the Glastonbury Road, which I've been doing some work with residents there to try to work out how we more fairly do parking on that development, because she's absolutely right. It's opposite the Wales Medical Centre and it's only a short walk into town, and there are plenty of people who park in their development in order to go to the medical centre into town rather than use the car parks. And Crest and their management company are doing some stuff there with sort of parking restrictions and a residence parking scheme that should mean that that's no longer such a problem for Becky. But there is a sort of wider issue about the way that we do planning from a parking perspective, because what we say, we have sort of these formulas, as I understand it, that say that a house of a certain size must have one parking space and a house of another size must have two. but that parking space could either be a driveway or it could be a garage, and your garage is supposed to be a parking space. But for most people, there's no chance I'd get my car into my garage.
Yeah.
It's absolutely rammed full of kids' bikes and all sorts of stuff. And so we've just got to be a bit more realistic about the way that families live, and also be a bit more honest about the fact that this is not the London suburbs, and that actually, if you've got a family home, the probability is that there are 2 cars in that household, and that even if you can make it as hard as you like to keep 2 cars, but there isn't the public transport links to manage without those cars.
Well, in the news this morning there was a story saying that there's a high percentage of people in this country that just cannot get anywhere unless they drive.
Exactly.
Because public transport isn't up to the job.
Exactly. And so our planning should surely recognise that we need to be building developments with sufficient parking for the reality that most households are going to have 2 cars. Even if it's only a 2-bedroom house, there's probably still going to be 2 cars in that household. And actually, there are sort of 3 or 4 5-bedroom houses that have been built on these developments where maybe they've got teenage kids where there are 4 or 5 cars in a house. And that's just the reality of being in a rural area or semi-rural area like we are here. So we've got to get that right. On the issue of sort of parking in Wales more generally, it is a perennial problem. There has been discussion about whether or not there should be a residence parking scheme. That was being consulted on some of the roads around by St Cuthbert's Church last year. The other hotspot always is sort of Silver Street over around the back of the High Street and by the Bishop's Barn. There is, I think, a need to look at this much more seriously. If you look at sort of other places where Wales is actually quite a sort of densely populated place. It's sort of lots of houses and things on top of each other. And if you look in Bath, if you look in sort of the Clifton bit of Bristol, there are residence parking schemes in those sorts of places, and it seems to me that Wales would lend itself to that sort of arrangement. That would certainly provide some respite for those who live on those roads who don't have off-street parking, as most of them don't, but quite not unreasonably want to park near to their homes. The final issue that I would want to mention on parking is, I know you had people on earlier on your show talking about tourism. We just need to be a bit better at the parking provision we put on for tourists. We're doing better, much better with coach parties, and Wales has really invested in that as a sort of growth area. But it would be nice, I think, to have a properly long-term car park option for visitors to the city, so that they were able to kind of really come in and not feel rushed. They could go to the cathedral, have a look around, go shopping, have some lunch, and then sort of wander back to their car after 5 or 6 hours here. Whereas at the moment, I think most people sort of feel that they have to be out of here inside 3 or 4 because that's the car parks that are available.
But also at the other end of that, you kind of need short-term parking for local people who, if we want to continue to use our high streets, you want to know that you can nip somewhere and not have to faff around in a car park where you're time for a couple of hours.
But I very, very rarely get complaints about that, because other than on market day, when these parking spaces outside the cafe here are unavailable. But even then, there's normally somewhere you can park on the high street for just 20 minutes. So short stay, literally just coming to go to the post office and one other shop and then away, that's very, very rarely the issue. Right. Much more the issue is to do with people parking whilst they're at work and parking outside people's homes and annoying them, and also a parking offer for people who are visiting the city to sort of grow the tourism offer here.
Well, we are speaking of roads and the situation. We've got a question here comment from Bridget in Gurney Slade, who asked, would you consider putting zebra crossing between Tesco and the bus station? It's painful to see people trying to cross the road. People should come first, especially, she reminds us, we are in a city.
Yeah, so I'd certainly consider it. I mean, it's not my decision to take, I'm afraid.
We could get some paint. We could go and do that now.
Let's go do it. I'm just trying to sort of picture in my mind, because I was speaking to some of the residents in the Home Chime retirement home that's just around the corner on Priory Road, and they're very keen for a sort of crossing outside there. I think, is there not a crossing just the other side of Tesco's to sort of get you across? So I have a feeling, I might be wrong, someone will sort of come in very quickly, but she's right. There's the pedestrian exit from the Tesco car park, and lots of people, I'm sorry Tesco's to tell you this, but lots and lots of people park in Tesco's and then sort of leave from that exit, cross the road, and then take the pathway through the bus station up onto the high street. Putting a crossing there would clearly make much more sense, but it might mean that we just need to move the crossing that's further up the road.
Right, okay. It's BBC Somerset, it's 10:46. We'll talk defence, if we may. Obviously, your background, you were in the forces for a decade or more. What are your thoughts on our forces, what they're capable of? Fund-wise, do we need more? Do we need to know what kind of forces we want in order to be able to afford the forces that we need?
Yes, we need to put more money into defence. The defence and capability reviews that were going on 15 years ago were not unsound. They were looking at a post-Cold War threat spectrum, and they were observing that armour on armour, sort of peer on peer conflict in the ocean or on the northern European plains was no longer a probability, and that the threat was shifting into a sort of Balkan-style peace enforcement counterinsurgency operation, and then shifted again into a sort of much more asymmetric Afghan-Iraq-style counterinsurgency. And it wasn't reasonable, I think, at that point to say, well, this is the spending envelope for defence, and all that we are doing is shifting it from there to there because the capability that we now need has changed. What is the reality since then is that a resurgent and belligerent Russia means that there is now, again, the possibility of armour-on-armour, peer-on-peer conflict, and therefore the threat spectrum expands from counterinsurgency to include that high-end peer-on-peer warfare again. Then there's this emerging frontier in cyber and in space, and that expands the threat spectrum again. We are having to deal with piracy on our seas now at a level that hadn't been seen for 100 years or more before. That expands the threat spectrum again. And so if you then say, okay, well, look, no longer is this a shift in the threat, this is just a quick expansion, then you have to have a conversation about what is the strategic ambition of the United Kingdom. Is our strategic ambition that we are unilaterally capable of protecting ourselves from all of those threats, in which case we need to spend significantly more than 2% of our GDP on defence, or are we saying that there are certain things that we need to have as a sovereign capability, but other things that we would only ever be able to deal with in coalition with others, in which case you probably still can't just spend 2%, but the necessary increase in the defence budget is somewhat less. We've just got to start having that conversation, and what we should not be doing, and I made this point to Gavin Williamson when I was sat in his office on Wednesday evening having this exact conversation, is we've got to stop pretending that somehow this capability review is not a spending review. At the moment, the tail is wagging the dog, and we are buying and maintaining as much capability as we can afford, rather than the capability we need to meet the threats that we've identified as ones that we want to be able to address on our own, unilaterally, as the United Kingdom.
When you were in the forces, because you were there, did you feel that there was enough money then? Did you have the equipment, the resources, the people that you needed, or has it always been stretched?
No, so lots and lots was made of this at the time. When my first operational tour was to Kabul in 2005, and we were facing a threat at that stage, in that place at that time, that was perfectly easily countered with the vehicles and equipment that we had available to us. There's no doubt about it that once they started to operate in Helmand the following year, the lack of helicopters was a massive problem. The lack of protecting mobility was a massive problem. But in fairness, the Labour government moved very, very quickly to purchase additional helicopters and to provide vehicles appropriate to that environment. When I served in Basra in 2007, we were operating in a wholly refurbished fleet of vehicles that had attached to them state-of-the-art armour that had been bought as an urgent operating requirement by the then Labour government. And when I was in Sangin in 2009, the stuff that troops were wearing then and the vehicles that were available and the amazing amount of helicopters and fast air in the sky was all the product of huge amounts of money being spent. But those were done as urgent operational purchases to meet the immediate needs on the ground. Now, morally, that's correct, because soldiers deserve to be as well protected as the country can afford. But what we need to be doing is much better at understanding what those threats are. And actually, if 20 years ago we had bought the medium weight mechanised armoured capability that the army has been seeking for sort of 20 years or so, we wouldn't have needed to buy urgent operating requirement stuff at a premium for Afghanistan and Iraq, because we've already had it, because we would have been much more strategic in our purchasing 20 years ago. So no, I didn't ever feel that I personally, on the tours that I was on, was exposed through a lack of equipment. But I also recognise that we bought lots and lots of equipment in a hurry off the shelf to meet that immediate need. And if we'd been more strategic in our thinking about how we were renewing our defence capability, we probably wouldn't have needed to do it that way.
Well, we're on the subject of defence. Here's a clip from Barbara from Limpsham, who's got in touch.
Good morning, James. My question is about the aircraft carrier that's currently being fitted out. If the government were to change because of a general election in the near future, what would happen with our plans for completing this vehicle? I just feel that we're a bit vulnerable with Mr. Corbyn absolutely hating anything to do with defence. He seems to think that we can exist by smiling at everyone in the world, and it's wrong. We need some defence. We're in a very bad situation at the moment. We're very vulnerable.
What do you think?
Well, Barbara tempts me towards a highly partisan answer. I absolutely agree with the premise of her question. I think that Jeremy Corbyn says one thing about defence 1 minute and then an entirely different thing the next, and that is going to be of huge encouragement to our enemies and should be of huge concern to those of us who worry about the safety of our nation. But on the more sort of substantive question about I think that Barbara's referring to HMS Prince of Wales, which is the second of the aircraft carriers, because I'm sure she, like me, watched the commissioning of the HMS Queen Elizabeth yesterday with huge pride. I think we're committed to that carrier programme now. We will have 2 aircraft carriers and we will have an air wing that will fly off them both. I think that the contracts are far too well advanced for that not to be the case. And although there have been options discussed about whether the Prince of Wales could be sort of put into a sort of suspended animation, I think the reality is that if we've got them, we're going to use them. And I'd like to think, but Jeremy Corbyn never ceases to surprise. I'd like to think that even he would recognise that the United Kingdom is safer and stronger with aircraft carriers afloat rather than mothballed in Plymouth or Portsmouth even.
It's a difficult one, though, isn't it? Because one of the sort of points that came up then is that there is a bit of short-termism with governments, particularly now we've got the fixed 5-year government term that was put into law a few years ago. How easy is it when the country is in the state that it's in, financially we're still not in a great place, we've got all of the Brexit stuff on the go, to think longer term? That's a challenge for whoever is in government. There's a lot of quick fix that perhaps doesn't always fix the problem.
So I think you're right, government and the electoral cycle lends itself to short-termism, and that is a big problem when sort of worrying about strategic investments. Governments are very loath to make investments that pay off when potentially they're out of power and therefore are to the political advantage of your opponents. On defence, there has normally been a consensus, and do you know what? In Parliament there still is. Corbyn and his immediate group of supporters are at odds with the majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party when it comes to what defence should look like, and most significant amongst that is the continuous at sea nuclear deterrent. I would be pretty confident that, well, I was about to say pretty confident if he was Prime Minister he would, but I don't think I believe that one bit. I think if he were Prime Minister, all bets would be off on what our defence would look like. I suspect Barbara's question is probably entirely right. That's a sobering thought, isn't it?
Yeah, 5 to 11 rather. It's BBC Somerset. We've got James Heappey, the MP from Wales here. We're into the last bit before you have to go off and face the rest of your day. So we've got a few questions and comments that have been coming in. If we can rattle through them, that'd be great. But Harriet in Burnham is picking you up on the social media talk that we did earlier. Harriet says, I disagree with James this morning. I think social media is a really good way of giving a much wider picture. I feel a lot of we see on social media we don't see or hear on the traditional media. A lot of the media is right-wing, she says.
Go on iPlayer. The BBC did a brilliant documentary a month or so ago about how social media works and how it's impacted on recent sort of elections in the United States and in the UK. What I was saying was not a matter of opinion. Social media works by algorithm that reinforces the post that you interact with.
Okay, we have a comment here from Marion, who, sorry, no, I'm lying, it's from Jan in Walton, who says, I work in Wales and paying for parking is an absolute nightmare. I was 20 minutes late for work the other day because I couldn't park. Surely a park and ride or a multi-storey would help the city.
So Mendip District Council would immediately be jumping up and down, pointing out that there is a multi-storey at Waitrose. It's just that people tend not to use it because it's a bit far out of town. I think that the discussions that have been going on for some time about maybe a car park out on Palace Fields might be a good option. Certainly that's what the local tourism industry would like to see. We need to do something. Parking in Wales is very challenging, and if we want to be a major tourism destination as well as a good place to live and work, clearly parking needs to be resolved quite urgently.
Okay, Marion, who I mentioned earlier, has got in touch, and she says, please ask James Heappey why the Conservative government shows such disregard for the democratic process by abstaining from voting on issues the government doesn't like.
So that's not quite what's happening. In opposition day debates, the government is not bound by the result, but there is a reality to the way that people now, a lot of things like They Work For You have, which are websites that purport to show our voting records. They don't distinguish between the way we vote on matters that are actually legislating and making laws and our votes that matter versus the way that we are voting on sort of non-binding motions that have been brought by the opposition and are very often brought in order to sort of make a political point. And I'm not sure that in any way we are disengaging from the democratic process simply by not wanting to be drawn into those political traps. The House of Commons is our nation's legislature. It's not a place where we should all just sit around signalling our virtue.
We talked a lot this morning about you as an MP and your thoughts and your views, and we thank you for spending the hour with us. Let's talk about you, the man. Christmas coming. What are you up to? Where are you up to? You still got a list of lots of things to do?
Yeah, so December is a very, very busy time of year. I will do lots of carol services, and I think that all of the carol service organisers in the constituency conspire to make sure that I get a different reading at each carol service, so I can't just learn one. And that diary starts to wind down a couple of days before Christmas, and then I will be at home in Axbridge with my family, having a week or two off and enjoying doing nothing for a couple of days other than being with the kids.
And can you unwind? Can you, spend a week or two off and try and avoid the news, the social media? Can you, or do you still always clued up?
I mean, it's hard to avoid the news and social media, but I try to. I mean, there's a real danger in my job, and I suppose many other jobs, that all that your kids ever see of you is the bit of your face that isn't covered by your iPhone. And I just think that there's a responsibility from time to time to just put it down and shut down and sort of let them, play with them. And I can't say what I hope to be building on Christmas Day, because that would make my son very excited and spoil the surprise. But I'm looking forward to a couple of days of great fun with the kids.
Well, build carefully and watch those bits that you haven't built yet, because they're a devil if you tread on them.
Yeah.
James Heappey, thank you very much for your time this morning.